For almost 70 years, everyone studying one of the most famous discoveries in history was asking the wrong question. The entire world wanted to know just one thing. What do the words inside the Dead Sea Scrolls actually say? Scholars translated the languages, argued over meanings, and spent decades analyzing every line of text. But almost nobody stopped to ask a much simpler question. What were these scrolls physically made from? Then, in 2020, a DNA study landed that flipped the whole picture upside down. Researchers did not study the ink this time. They studied the actual DNA locked inside the animal skins the scrolls were written on. And what they uncovered put a huge question mark over a theory that had been treated as settled fact for decades. Just think about it. What if the skin of a single animal could prove that one of history's most trusted stories was never the full truth? Were these scrolls really written in the exact place they were discovered? Or did some of them start their journey somewhere completely different? And what evidence finally forced scholars to reconsider something they had believed for generations? In this video, we are going through the whole story from the very beginning, from a shepherd's lost goat in 1947, all the way to a DNA lab in 2020 that changed everything we thought we knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before we get into it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. The story begins in 1947, near the Dead Sea, not far from Jordan. A young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was out searching for a goat that had wandered off. While looking around the hills, he came across a cave and, thinking his goat might be hiding inside, tossed a stone through the opening. Instead of hearing a startled goat, he heard the unmistakable sound of a clay jar shattering. Curious, he climbed in to look. Inside, he found several large clay jars that appeared to have been sealed shut for a very long time. When one jar was finally opened, it was filled with old leather scrolls, carefully wrapped in linen cloth. At that moment, neither the shepherd nor anyone else on Earth realized this would turn into one of the greatest archaeological finds in human history. What followed was years of digging in the area. Between 1947 and 1956, researchers uncovered thousands of fragments spread across 11 separate caves near Qumran. In total, roughly 25,000 individual pieces were recovered, eventually identified as fragments belonging to nearly 1,000 different manuscripts. Among them were the oldest known copies of biblical texts, like Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, along with numerous other writings covering religious law, hymns, and prophecy. Scientists dated the material to somewhere between 250 BCE and 68 CE. What made this discovery so significant wasn't simply that extremely old documents had survived. It mattered because these scrolls offered a rare, detailed window into the religious and historical world of that era, something previously known only in fragments. Once the scrolls became public knowledge, the biggest question on everyone's mind was simple: who actually wrote them? Over the following years, one theory gradually became the dominant explanation, known as the Essene theory. According to this idea, the scrolls were produced by a Jewish religious sect called the Essenes, a group also referenced by ancient writers like Josephus and Pliny the Elder. Based on those old accounts, the Essenes were described as living simply, away from mainstream society, strictly following religious law, and spending much of their time copying sacred texts as part of a devoted religious lifestyle. The site where the scrolls were found, known as the Qumran settlement, was believed to have been their home base. Several details seem to support this. Some scrolls contained community rules that matched the description of a tightly organized religious group. Others referenced a solar calendar, different from the lunar calendar used at the temple in Jerusalem at the time, suggesting this community followed its own distinct religious practice. Among the collection was also a well-known text called the War Scroll, describing a final battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. Many scholars felt that only a group which saw itself as separate from the rest of society would produce a document like that. Over time, this theory became so widely accepted that it was treated almost as settled fact. Museums built entire exhibits around it. Documentaries repeated the same narrative. Students in classrooms were taught, often without question, that the Essenes wrote these scrolls, treasured them, and eventually hid them in the caves to keep them safe from the invading Roman army. For nearly 70 years, this remained the accepted explanation. But slowly, cracks started to appear that the theory could not fully explain. It started with handwriting. When researchers compared fragments side by side, they noticed the handwriting was far from uniform. Some pieces were written with clean, confident strokes by clearly trained scribes, while others looked much rougher and more amateur. If a single tight-knit community had produced all of it, why would the handwriting vary so much? Scientists then turned to the parchment itself, the animal skin the text was written on. Some pieces were made from high-quality, carefully prepared material, while others were rougher and far more ordinary. Writing styles varied noticeably, too. This raised an uncomfortable question. Were all of these documents really produced in the same location? Then came carbon dating, and the results made things even more confusing. Some scrolls turned out to be older than the Qumran settlement itself. If the settlement wasn't built until later, how could scrolls written earlier have ended up there? Another odd clue surfaced from the book of Jeremiah. Researchers found two distinctly different versions of the text, one considerably longer, one noticeably shorter, with the chapters even arranged in a different order. If a single strict religious community had produced and preserved its own texts, why would it be holding on to two conflicting versions of the same book? These questions opened the door to a handful of alternative theories. Some scholars suggested Qumran might not have been a religious settlement at all, but instead a pottery workshop. Others floated the idea it may have functioned as a military outpost. A few even proposed the caves served as a kind of sacred storage site where holy texts from multiple locations were gathered for safekeeping. All of these ideas sounded plausible on paper, but none of them had solid proof behind them. So, by default, the old Essene theory kept its place as the leading explanation. Then, someone entered the picture who wasn't a historian or an archaeologist at all, and one simple question from that person ended up reshaping the entire debate. In 2012, an ordinary lunch at Tel Aviv University quietly changed the direction of Dead Sea Scrolls research. Sitting at the same table that day were two people from completely different fields. One was Oded Richavi, a molecular biologist specializing in ancient DNA. The other was Noam Mizrahi, a scholar who had spent years studying the scrolls themselves. As their conversation went on, it circled back to a long-standing frustration. Around 25,000 fragments had already been cataloged, yet figuring out which fragment belonged with which scroll remained incredibly difficult. Up to that point, researchers relied on comparing handwriting, language, texture, and personal experience to piece fragments together, a method that was never fully reliable. More than once, two fragments that looked like an obvious match later turned out to belong to entirely separate manuscripts. During the conversation, Mizrahi mentioned that all of these scrolls were written on parchment made from animal skin. When Richavi heard that detail, he paused for a moment, then said a single sentence that changed everything. Parchment contains DNA. That one line opened up a completely new line of thinking. If these scrolls came from animal hide, could traces of DNA still survive inside that material after all this time? And if so, could that DNA reveal where a scroll was actually produced, which animal it came from, and which scattered fragments truly belong together? What's remarkable is that nobody had seriously pursued this angle for decades. Everyone had been focused on the writing itself, while DNA researchers worked in a completely separate field entirely. It was only when these two worlds accidentally collided over lunch that the idea finally took shape. Now came the real challenge. If DNA was the key, how could anyone actually extract it? The Dead Sea Scrolls are considered among the most valuable and fragile manuscripts on the planet. Cutting into them, scraping a sample, or removing even a tiny piece was completely out of the question. Researchers needed the genetic material without damaging the scrolls in any way. After years of thinking it through, scientists landed on an unusual but clever solution. Instead of sampling the scrolls directly, they turned their attention to the storage boxes the scrolls had been kept in for decades. Over the years, tiny particles of dust had naturally flaked off the parchment and settled at the bottom of these containers. That dust became the key to everything. It contained microscopic traces of collagen, the primary protein found in animal skin, and scientists believed fragments of ancient DNA could still be preserved inside those particles. This meant they never had to touch the written portions of any scroll. Samples were taken only from blank edges and from dust collected inside the storage boxes, with zero damage to the actual manuscripts. These samples were sent to specialized ancient DNA laboratories, and these were not ordinary labs. Every surface was sterilized with UV light, positive air pressure was maintained to prevent outside. Contamination, and every single step, was tightly controlled to make sure modern DNA didn't accidentally mix in with the ancient samples. This process took years, not days. Many samples turned out unusable, others had to be tested multiple times, but eventually the team successfully pulled reliable DNA sequences from several different scrolls. For the very first time, researchers were working with hard genetic evidence instead of educated guesses. When the final results came back, scientists expected them to mostly confirm what everyone already believed. Instead, the report contained a detail nobody saw coming, and that single finding began unraveling a story that had stood unquestioned for 70 years. After all that painstaking work, the initial results looked fairly ordinary at first glance. Most of the scrolls turned out to be made from sheepskin, exactly what researchers had expected, since sheep and goats can survive easily in the dry desert terrain of Judea with very little water. Nothing surprising there. But then something in the data caught everyone off guard. A handful of scrolls had actually been made from cowhide. On its own, that might have seemed like a minor detail. But once scientists compared it against the geography of the region, everything changed. Qumran sits in an extremely arid desert environment, where water is scarce and the surrounding land is mostly barren. Raising cattle in conditions like that is nearly impossible, since cows require large amounts of water daily along with green pasture for grazing, resources Qumran simply didn't have. That left only one logical conclusion. Any scroll made from cow skin almost certainly wasn't produced at Qumran. It must have come from somewhere else, a region with enough water and grazing land to support cattle, and was later transported to Qumran. In other words, at least some of the scrolls had originated elsewhere and were brought to the site afterward. When this finding reached Mina Shore, a leading Dead Sea Scrolls specialist at the Israel Antiquities Authority, even she needed a moment to process it. She had spent years working directly with these artifacts, and now a single DNA report was putting cracks in a story that had stood for decades. It was becoming increasingly clear the Essene theory could not be the whole picture. If some scrolls had genuinely come from elsewhere, how could the entire collection belong to just one isolated community? And this was only the beginning, because DNA was about to reveal even deeper connections between scrolls, tracing their different origins and telling a far more complicated story than anyone expected. After confirming that a number of scrolls were made from cowhide, researchers didn't stop at simply identifying the animal source. They pushed further, trying to figure out how different scrolls might be connected to one another, and this is where the investigation really took off. Every individual animal carries its own unique genetic signature, essentially a biological fingerprint. Scientists began comparing the DNA extracted from different scroll fragments. If two pieces came from the same animal, their genetic markers lined up closely. If they came from separate animals, the patterns diverged. A major breakthrough came through mitochondrial DNA, a type of genetic material that stays remarkably stable across generations, making it far easier to determine whether two parchment samples came from the same animal or from entirely different ones. For the first time, scholars had a method rooted in hard science rather than guesswork. During this stage of research, another intriguing detail emerged. Some scrolls contained DNA from different animals that were nonetheless part of the same related herd, suggesting those particular parchments were likely produced in the same general area. Meanwhile, other scrolls carried completely unrelated genetic signatures, pointing to a totally different point of origin. Gradually, researchers started mapping out distinct production centers, identifying which scrolls likely came from the same region and which had traveled from elsewhere before eventually being gathered in one place. Nobody had ever been able to trace this before. DNA testing also confirmed several fragment matches that had previously only been guessed at through handwriting comparison. In some cases, the old assumptions held up. But in plenty of other cases, DNA proved that pieces long believed to belong to the same scroll had actually come from entirely different sources. For the first time, scholars weren't just working with opinions. They had physical, testable evidence in hand. The picture coming into focus was far bigger than a single settlement or a single community. The Dead Sea Scrolls were shaping up to be a massive collection of documents produced across different regions and different time periods, eventually brought together in one location. And yet, the most convincing piece of evidence was still waiting to be uncovered. It came, once again, from the book of Jeremiah, and it finally settled a debate that had dragged on for decades. DNA testing had already proven that not every scroll shared the same origin, but the strongest confirmation came from the book of Jeremiah, the same text that had raised eyebrows years earlier. Researchers had already identified two very different versions of the book. One was the longer version, closely resembling the Hebrew Bible we know today. The other was shorter, with entire sections condensed and even the chapter order rearranged. Historians had long assumed one version was probably a later edit, or possibly the result of a scribe's mistake somewhere along the line. DNA told a very different story. When both versions were tested, scientists discovered the longer version had been written on sheepskin, while the shorter version was written on cowhide. This wasn't just a difference in materials. It strongly implied the two versions were produced in entirely different regions and likely preserved by two separate communities over time. In other words, there wasn't just one single official version of Jeremiah circulating at the time. Different communities were holding on to and trusting their own version as the correct one. This possibility had been floated before, but now it had real scientific backing behind it. A similar pattern showed up in another religious text called Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, found at both Qumran and Masada. DNA testing on multiple copies revealed they were written on the skin of different animals entirely, meaning the text wasn't tied to one small, isolated group. It had been copied, shared, and circulated across multiple locations. This marked the first time scientists began using DNA not just to trace origins, but to actually study how a religious text traveled, who preserved it, and how different versions of the same tradition developed side by side. The picture was becoming much clearer. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't telling the story of a single isolated community. They offered a rare glimpse into an entire network of religious groups spread across ancient Judea. By this stage, DNA testing had made one thing undeniable. These scrolls did not all come from the same place, which raised the obvious next question. If they weren't the product of one single community, then what exactly were they? And how did so many different documents end up gathered in the same location? Many researchers found their answer in an old Jewish tradition known as a geniza, essentially a sacred storage space where aging or damaged religious texts were kept out of respect rather than discarded. Jewish law held that any document containing the name of God could never be torn up, burned, or thrown away, no matter how worn or fragile it became. Once a text was no longer fit for regular use, it had to be preserved somewhere respectful instead of destroyed. Many historians now believe the caves at Qumran may have functioned as one large geniza. The historical timeline supports this idea well. Jerusalem sat only about 20 kilometers from Qumran, a difficult but entirely manageable journey in that era. Then, between 68 and 70 CE, the Roman army invaded Judea, and Jerusalem suffered massive destruction. Many scholars believe this crisis was exactly when people from different communities rushed to protect their most valuable religious texts, hiding them away in these caves for safekeeping. If that's the case, the caves likely held far more than the documents of a single sect. They may have contained texts from multiple communities, including family-owned scrolls passed down for generations, as well as scrolls from various local synagogues. When danger arrived, all of it was gathered and hidden in one place for protection. If this theory holds up, then the Dead Sea Scrolls were never the private library of one small, isolated religious sect. They represent a much larger collection, drawing together the beliefs, traditions, and sacred writings of multiple communities across ancient Judea. That would explain the differing handwriting, the varying versions, and the parchment sourced from multiple regions. DNA research, for the first time, tied all these scattered pieces into one coherent picture. The real significance of this DNA research went far beyond simply tracing where the scrolls physically came from. It forced historians to rethink how they understood the Bible in the earliest period of Christianity. For a long time, the assumption was that religious texts already existed in one fixed, standardized form during that era. But the Dead Sea Scrolls showed that multiple versions of the same books existed side by side. The book of Jeremiah was the clearest example, with its two distinctly different versions. Now, DNA had confirmed these weren't simple copying errors. They were genuinely separate texts, used by different communities in different regions. And this pattern wasn't limited to Jeremiah alone. Multiple copies of books like Genesis and Psalms turned up with small wording differences, altered chapter order, and sections that were either expanded or shortened. This made it clear there was no single, universally fixed version of these texts at the time. It also carried a deeper implication. The process now referred to as canonization, deciding which religious texts would ultimately be treated as official scripture, was still very much unfinished during this period. Different communities held onto whatever texts they had and built their religious practice around them. In many ways, the shape of these traditions was still being formed. This also explains why we see such varied interpretations from that era, with different groups understanding the same core teachings in noticeably different ways. That was the religious landscape of the time. From a distance, it may have looked unified, but underneath the surface, many different ideas and traditions were coexisting at once. This was also the exact period during which Jesus was teaching, surrounded by a society already shaped by multiple religious viewpoints and multiple versions of sacred texts. A short while later, as the early Christian movement began taking shape, that same diverse religious environment carried forward, with different communities continuing to build on their own beliefs and traditions. This is exactly why the Dead Sea Scrolls are now considered more valuable than ever for understanding that entire period. None of this DNA research claims that today's Bible is somehow wrong. What it shows instead is that the process behind its formation was long, gradual, and shaped by the contributions of many different communities over time. That's why historians increasingly view these scrolls not merely as ancient artifacts, but as a genuine window into the full religious landscape of that world. The story is far from finished, because this same DNA research also opened up new questions that scientists are still working through today. Since the 2020 publication of this research, the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls has entered an entirely new phase. In the past, scholars mainly focused on decoding what a scroll actually said. Now just as much attention is going toward figuring out where each scroll was physically produced, how it made its way to Qumran, and which communities it was connected to. One major goal now is identifying separate production centers, essentially working out which scrolls came from the same region and which arrived from elsewhere. Thanks to DNA analysis, this task has become far more manageable than it ever was before. Alongside that, researchers are investing heavily in geographic mapping. The hope is that, eventually, scientists will be able to look at a small piece of parchment and determine roughly where in the ancient world the animal it came from actually lived. To make that possible, teams are building an extensive ancient animal DNA database, drawing samples from different regions. And the larger that database grows, the more precise these results will become. It isn't just genetics driving this new wave of research either. Technologies like multispectral imaging are now being used alongside DNA analysis, allowing scientists to read text that is completely invisible to the naked eye. In many cases, faded or damaged writing that seemed lost forever is becoming legible again, and these findings are then cross-checked against DNA data to build a fuller, more complete picture. But every answer this research produces seems to generate a fresh set of questions. Were there several major centers of religious writing spread across ancient Judea? How closely connected were these different communities to one another? Did they actively exchange copies of their sacred texts? And exactly how did individual scrolls travel from one location to another over time? Researchers are now working to map out an entire network of ancient communities, trying to understand the relationships between them and how their sacred writings moved and spread. In short, scholars are no longer simply reading the words on these scrolls. They are tracing their physical journeys and piecing together an entire map of ancient religious life. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is clearly far from over. If anything, the real depth of this research has only just begun. Every new piece of technology uncovers another hidden layer of history, and every new answer tends to open the door to another question. If this entire story had to be summed up in one sentence, it would probably be this. For nearly 70 years, the world was asking the wrong question. Everyone wanted to know what the Dead Sea Scrolls said, while almost nobody stopped to ask what they were actually made of. That single overlooked question ended up reshaping the entire field of research. DNA testing proved that reading the ink alone was never going to be enough. The animal skin. These words were written on, carried its own hidden story the whole time. Historians had spent decades reading the ink. Now scientists are reading the DNA as well, and when both pieces of evidence are combined, an entirely new picture emerges, one nobody had seen clearly before. This research didn't simply prove an old theory wrong for the sake of it. It demonstrated something bigger, that our understanding of history is never truly final. What gets accepted as settled truth today can always be tested again once new tools and technology become available, and that willingness to keep questioning is one of science's greatest strengths. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story is where it started. Not in a high-tech laboratory, but in 1947 with an ordinary shepherd chasing after a lost goat. He had no idea that a single stone thrown into a dark cave would eventually open the door to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries the world has ever seen. Decades passed. Thousands of studies were published. Countless books were written. Dozens of theories came and went. And then the genetic breakthrough of 2020 forced everyone to look at this ancient story through a completely new lens. Scientists today are no longer asking only what the scrolls say. They want to know where each one was made, what path it traveled, and which communities kept it safe through the centuries. Which means this research is nowhere near finished. New DNA techniques, advanced imaging tools, and other emerging methods may uncover even more hidden details in the years ahead, and it's entirely possible that even more long-held beliefs about the Dead Sea Scrolls will need to be re-examined. In the end, the simplest way to describe this whole journey is this. A shepherd opened the door by accident. Scientists spent decades uncovering the real story hidden behind it. And DNA didn't just change what we know about a set of ancient scrolls, it changed the very way we read history itself. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story like this one.